Imagine descending toward the bottom of the Mariana Trench wearing a fully armored, military-grade diving suit. You might expect nothing but pitch-black water and a few tiny, ghost-like creatures drifting past. But in reality, you wouldn't get anywhere near the bottom. Long before that, the pressure would crush your lungs inward. Game over. The Mariana Trench holds the most extreme pressure environment on Earth, over 1,000 times greater than what we experience at sea level. No human body is built for that. And no matter how advanced a diving suit claims to be, it wouldn't stand a chance. You wouldn't just be injured, you'd be physically collapsed by the ocean itself. So logically, a place like this should be completely lifeless. Nothing should be able to exist under that kind of force, right? But if you know anything about the deep ocean, you already know logic doesn't always apply down there. The deep sea isn't empty. It's alive, and not just alive, but massive. This is where sharks exist that were already swimming when Isaac Newton was alive. Where squids grow longer than buses. Where evolution takes a familiar shape and stretches it into something unsettling. Deep-sea gigantism turns the ocean into a place of real, living nightmares. But the Mariana Trench isn't just part of the deep ocean. It's the deepest location on the entire planet. So the real question isn't whether life exists in the deep sea, it's what, if anything, can survive all the way down there. To understand that, we first need to understand where the Mariana Trench actually begins. The trench reaches a depth of roughly 10,984 meters, but that number is measured from the ocean's surface. The trench itself doesn't start at the surface. Its upper rim begins around 5,000 meters below sea level. Everything above that point is surprisingly ordinary. It's just open ocean. Fish swim through it. Water currents move as usual. And if a human were floating there, they'd have no idea they were hovering above the deepest place on Earth. Nothing feels different until the ocean suddenly drops away beneath you. The Mariana Trench is so deep that even our biggest reference points start to feel useless. If you took Mount Everest, flipped it upside down, and dropped it straight into the ocean, its peak wouldn't even come close to the bottom. It would still stop nearly 7,000 feet above the trench floor, a place known as the Challenger Deep. And despite being the deepest location on Earth, it's one of the least visited places in human history. Only 22 people have ever made it all the way down there. To put that into perspective, more humans have walked on the moon than have reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So what would it actually take to get there? To reach the Challenger Deep, you wouldn't just be descending, you'd be passing through every single layer of the ocean, one by one. The journey starts in the epipelagic zone, the uppermost layer of the sea. This region extends down about 200 meters and is the only layer where a human could realistically survive without specialized equipment. Sunlight still reaches here. Life feels familiar. The upper portion even overlaps with the surface world. But reaching the bottom of this zone is already pushing the limits of what the human body can handle. Once you pass roughly 200 meters, you enter the mesopelagic zone. This depth marks a hard boundary for humans. The deepest free dive ever recorded reached about 214 meters, and that was done with extreme training, a wetsuit, and perfect conditions. And that record only barely touches the very top of this zone. The mesopelagic layer extends down to nearly 1,000 meters. No human freediver could ever reach its lower boundary. At these depths, pressure is roughly 100 times greater than at the surface. Without protection, death would be nearly instantaneous. And this is only the second layer of the ocean. Below that lies the bathypelagic zone, beginning around 1,000 meters and stretching down to about 4,000 meters. By this point, pressure alone would have crushed you long ago. But if, somehow, you were still alive, you wouldn't see anything at all. Sunlight is completely gone. Total darkness takes over. Temperatures drop near freezing. And the pressure here is strong enough to deform solid steel. So if you're wondering how the descent could possibly become even more extreme, it does. As mentioned earlier, the Mariana Trench doesn't begin at the surface. In fact, it doesn't even begin in what most people would consider the deep ocean. The trench itself starts around 5,000 meters below sea level, and at this point, we still haven't reached it. Beyond the bathypelagic zone lies the abyssopelagic zone, a region stretching roughly from 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep. This is easily one of the most fascinating layers of the ocean. Partly because the word abyss feels appropriate, but mostly because this zone is home to some of the strangest life forms ever discovered. For nearly the entire planet, this depth is the ocean floor. Almost all of the seafloor exists here. But for the Mariana Trench, this is only the beginning. By the time you reach the abyssopelagic zone, the pressure has climbed to more than 600 times what it is at the surface. Not that it matters anymore, any human body would have been destroyed thousands of meters above this point. And yet, life still exists here. Near the upper edge of the abyss, you might encounter something called Stygiomedusa gigantea, a name that leaves very little to the imagination. This enormous jellyfish is a textbook example of deep-sea gigantism. From end to end, including its ribbon-like arms, it can span more than 10 meters. It doesn't look like a jellyfish you'd recognize. Its tentacles hang in long, flat ribbons, drifting silently through the water. In over a century of exploration, humans have only recorded around 100 sightings of this so-called giant phantom jelly. Because encounters are so rare, scientists still don't know its true size limits. Estimates suggest it weighs around 150 pounds, large, but surprisingly light, as jellyfish tend to be. Even more strangely, it doesn't sting. Instead of venom, it relies on patience. Those long ribbon arms act like slow-moving traps, quietly entangling small creatures unlucky enough to drift too close. No aggression. No chase. Just waiting in the dark. It's almost like underwater flypaper, except scaled up by deep-sea gigantism. But as you move toward the very bottom of the abyssal zone, something even more unsettling appears. One of the largest squids on Earth lives here. And no, it's not the famous giant squid, even though that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. Giant squids actually don't descend this far. The abyssal zone is too deep for them. At most, they're found in upper midwater regions of the ocean. You might then think of the colossal squid. And while they can inhabit parts of the upper abyss, you still wouldn't find them in the Mariana Trench. Colossal squids are tied almost exclusively to Antarctic waters, far from this region. Instead, what waits here is something far stranger. It's known as magna pinna, more commonly called the big fin squid. If you've ever seen footage of the creepiest squids on Earth, this one almost always stands out. At least with the creatures we currently know about, it's hard to imagine anything more disturbing. Not because it's aggressive or powerful, but because of how unnatural it looks. Unlike the bulky, muscular build of a colossal squid, the big fin squid appears fragile and skeletal. Its arms stretch downward at sharp angles, hanging impossibly long beneath its body. Sometimes it doesn't swim at all, it just hovers, suspended in the dark, motionless. And the most unsettling part? We don't really know why it behaves this way. Marine biologists still aren't certain why its arms are shaped like that, or why it drifts instead of swimming. The species is so rare, and lives so deep, that most of what we know comes from brief, grainy footage, often of juveniles rather than full adults. It's not a living weapon like the colossal squid. But it doesn't need to be. Just looking at it feels wrong. These squids live so far beyond our reach that studying them is nearly impossible. Sightings are incredibly rare, and almost everything we know comes from brief encounters with juveniles rather than fully grown adults. When mature, their arms can extend to nearly 25 feet in length, bending sharply at odd, elbow-like angles that simply hang beneath the body. The most likely explanation is that those elongated arms act as passive traps, catching small animals drifting through the water. But here's the unsettling part: we've never captured or examined a living adult specimen. Everything we know comes from fleeting glimpses in the dark. They inhabit depths so extreme that some individuals may even cross into the upper hadal zone, a region so hostile that it's lethal to most squid species. And yes, the big fin squid is yet another example of deep-sea gigantism at work. But gigantism doesn't only affect massive predators. It can also turn small, harmless creatures into something far more unsettling. Take the giant isopod. It belongs to the same family as the tiny pill bugs you'd find under rocks on land. But instead of measuring a few millimeters, these deep-sea versions can reach nearly 20 inches in length. Compared to a human, they're small, but for an isopod, they're enormous. They're most commonly found near the upper abyssal depths. And while it might seem possible for them to descend even deeper into the hadal zone, it's extremely unlikely. There's no advantage in going further down, because the hadal zone may be the most unforgiving environment on Earth. This region doesn't even exist across most of the ocean. It appears only where tectonic forces rip the seafloor apart, forming deep trenches, places like the Mariana Trench. The hadal zone begins around 6,000 meters and plunges all the way down to nearly 11,000 meters. It doesn't extend any farther simply because it can't. The Challenger Deep marks the absolute limit. Down here, pressure exceeds 1,000 times what it is at sea level. Comparisons stop being useful at this point. Trying to imagine the force involved is almost meaningless. No everyday reference truly captures what it's like. You might expect this depth to be home to the largest, most terrifying creatures on the planet. But that's not what happens. The hadal zone is so brutally difficult to survive in that even deep-sea gigantism reaches a breaking point. There is a limit. Creatures can grow larger and larger until they hit a hard limit. The more mass an organism has, the more pressure is applied to every single part of its body. Every extra inch means more force trying to crush it. Smaller organisms actually have an advantage down here. They present less surface area for pressure to act on, and they have fewer complex internal systems that can fail or collapse. And there's an even bigger problem than pressure. There's almost nothing to eat. Food in the hadal zone is so scarce that at a certain depth, there simply isn't enough energy available to support large bodies. You can't grow massive if there's nothing to fuel that size. This part is rarely emphasized, because deep-sea content usually focuses on gigantism. But the hadal zone represents the exact opposite. It's where gigantism ends, and where the deepest form of biological downsizing begins. Animals don't grow endlessly. And while it's possible that somewhere else in the ocean there are squids larger than the giant squid we already know, it's extremely unlikely that any of them live deeper in the hadal zone. The environment is simply too extreme. So what does survive here? One of the most famous inhabitants is the Mariana snailfish, the deepest living fish ever discovered. And despite the name, it's not a snail. It's a fish. A small one. Almost transparent. No scales. Its body is so soft that under normal surface pressure, it would collapse under its own structure. But in the hadal zone, that softness is exactly what allows it to survive. Instead of resisting pressure, its body flexes and deforms without breaking. Some individuals are still close to a foot long, even at depths beyond 8,000 meters. Then there are amphipods, shrimp-like crustaceans capable of surviving all the way down to the Challenger Deep itself. Some species produce specialized proteins that prevent their cell membranes from being crushed. Others have been found feeding on tiny fragments of plastic that somehow made it to the deepest place on Earth. And on the trench floor itself live xenophyrophores, enormous single-celled organisms. Despite being just one cell, they can grow several inches across, spreading across the sediment like living structures. At this depth, life doesn't dominate. It endures. Some of these single-celled organisms can grow up to 4 inches across, making them among the largest single cells ever found on Earth. And strangely enough, xenophyrophores may be far more important than they look. By gathering sand grains and minerals, they form small, stable structures on the trench floor. These formations act like tiny shelters, giving other microscopic life a place to hide and survive in an environment that would otherwise be almost completely empty. Despite being just one cell, they function like miniature ecosystem engineers for the deep trenches. It's not as dramatic as massive squids or ancient sharks, but at this depth, it doesn't get much more impressive than that. Beyond them, life becomes even simpler. Worms, microbes, and other tiny scavengers dominate the hadal zone. They survive by feeding on marine snow, slowly falling particles made of dead plankton, waste, and fine organic debris drifting down from the upper ocean. The hadal zone isn't a hidden arena of giant sea monsters fighting in the dark. It's a place of survival at the absolute edge. Down here, you don't thrive. You either barely endure, or you don't exist at all. And that's exactly why the abyssal zone remains my favorite part of the ocean. That's where the truly strange giants still appear. The hadal zone is different, it's quieter, harsher, and far less forgiving. So where else does this extreme environment exist besides the Mariana Trench? The hadal zone forms when tectonic forces tear the abyssal plane apart, creating deep ocean trenches. These fractures plunge far below the rest of the seafloor, forming some of the most hostile environment on the planet. There are roughly 20 major ocean trenches worldwide, most of them located in the Pacific Ocean. Among the most well-known are the Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, and, of course, the Mariana Trench. But if surviving there is almost impossible, how do we even know what lives down there? The short answer is, we barely do. What little we know comes from a handful of extremely rare and dangerously complex missions. These expeditions require cutting-edge submersibles and people brave enough to trust their lives to them. Most submarines never come close. Even advanced military submarines, including nuclear-powered ones, are limited to depths of around 600 meters. That's nowhere near enough. Not even close to 6,000 meters, let alone nearly 11,000. Vehicles capable of reaching the trench aren't really submarines in the traditional sense. They're more like reinforced pressure capsules designed for one purpose, not collapsing. The first humans to ever reach the bottom did so in 1960. Jack Pickard and Don Walsh descended inside a submersible called the Trieste. And that journey would prove just how unforgiving the deepest place on Earth truly is. Imagine being sealed inside a steel sphere barely large enough for two people, slowly lowered nearly 11 kilometers into absolute darkness. This wasn't modern technology, it was the 1960s. Every sound, every vibration, came with the knowledge that no one truly knew if the vessel would hold. As they descended to around 10,900 meters, the pressure finally made itself known. One of the submersible's outer viewports cracked. A sharp, unmistakable reminder that the ocean was actively trying to crush them. For most people, that moment alone would have ended the mission. Somehow, they stayed calm and alive. They reached the seafloor and remained there for roughly 20 minutes before beginning the long, silent ascent back to the surface. It's hard not to imagine them staring at that damaged window the entire way up, waiting for it to fail. After that dive, no human returned to the Challenger deep for more than half a century. And honestly, it's not hard to understand why. The next major descent didn't happen until 2012, when filmmaker James Cameron, the same person behind Titanic and Avatar, made the journey alone. He piloted a single-person submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger. The name wasn't especially creative, but the achievement was historic. Cameron became the first person to reach the Challenger deep solo. His vehicle looked nothing like earlier designs. Shaped almost like a vertical drill or a twisted tower, it was covered in bright green panels and engineered for one purpose only, to survive extreme depth. When he reached the bottom, Cameron described the landscape as completely alien, flat, empty, and coated in fine gray sediment, like powdery dust. There were no massive creatures in sight, which fit perfectly with what we know about the limits of deep-sea gigantism. Then, in 2019, the depth record was broken again. Explorer Victor Vescovo descended in a submersible called the DSV Limiting Factor, reaching nearly 10,928 meters. It was only about 20 meters deeper than Cameron's dive, but records are records. Unlike earlier missions, this descent wasn't just about touching the bottom and leaving. Vescovo spent hours exploring, mapping the seafloor, and capturing footage of some of the most extreme life forms ever recorded on camera. Every dive added another small piece to our understanding of the deepest place on Earth. And even now, that understanding is far from complete. Even at the deepest point on Earth, the evidence of human activity is still there. Plastic waste has been found resting on the trench floor, proof that nothing on this planet is truly untouched. Despite a few historic descents, most of what we know about the Mariana Trench doesn't come from people going down themselves. It comes from machines. Remotely operated vehicles and deep-sea landers are lowered into the trench, sinking for hours through the water column before finally reaching the bottom. These devices are built to survive conditions no human ever could. They carry cameras, sensors, baited traps, and sometimes robotic arms capable of collecting samples. Their housings are made from titanium and thick, reinforced glass. And if even one component fails, the result is instant implosion. Even with all that technology, success is never guaranteed. The trenches are completely dark, near freezing, and coated in fine sediment that erupts into clouds the moment it's disturbed. Visibility disappears instantly. Navigation becomes guesswork. Most of the footage captured down there is brief, unstable, and grainy, sometimes lasting only a few minutes. But even that limited data is enough to prove something important. The hadal zone isn't lifeless. Almost every new expedition manages to uncover something we've never seen before, simply because exploration is so rare and so difficult. But one thing has remained consistent. There are no giants. Despite everything we've discovered, no massive monsters have been found lurking in the hadal depths. And for anyone hoping for enormous trench-dwelling beasts, the reality is disappointing, but honest. Trenches like the Mariana Trench weren't meant to host the giants of the deep. They aren't an extension of the deep ocean, they're its absolute limit. Environment so extreme that they exist only because Earth's tectonic plates tore the seafloor apart. These places don't reward dominance. They reward endurance. And only the few things capable of surviving, nothing more, are allowed to remain. Thank you for watching.